December 9, 1944. The frozen hills near Lanzerath, Belgium. Lieutenant Lyle Book Jr. crouched in his observation post, watching the mist rise from the valleys below. His intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men from the 99th Infantry Division, occupied a series of foxholes along a forested ridge overlooking a critical crossroads. Temperature hovered around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Behind them, just 3 miles west, lay the town of Buchholz Station, gateway to the vital road network the Allied command needed to maintain supply lines to forces pressing toward the German border. Book's men had been told this was a quiet sector, a place for green troops to get accustomed to frontline conditions without serious risk. They had no idea they were positioned directly in the path of the largest German offensive in the Western Theater. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 16 hours would transform a laughed-at defensive plan into one of the most extraordinary small-unit actions of the entire conflict, proving that sometimes genius looks like madness until the moment it saves everyone's lives. Lieutenant Book was 20 years old, one of the youngest platoon leaders in the First Army. He had graduated officer candidate school just 7 months earlier, ranking first in his class, despite being younger than most of his instructors. His platoon, designated Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, Headquarters Company, 394th Infantry Regiment, consisted of hand-picked men trained in observation, patrolling, and reporting enemy movements. They were not designed to hold ground against sustained attacks. Their entire arsenal consisted of rifles, 1 50 caliber machine gun, 2 30 caliber machine guns, and a handful of bazookas with limited ammunition. On the evening of December 8th, Book had called his squad leaders together in the cramped log-covered observation post they had constructed. Private First Class William James, a farm boy from Iowa who served as the 50 caliber gunner, remembered the meeting vividly in his later accounts. Sergeant Richard McKinley, the platoon's most experienced non-commissioned officer with 2 years of service, sat cleaning his rifle while Book spread a hand-drawn map across an ammunition crate. The young lieutenant pointed to the approaches from the east. Then McKinley said, his voice carrying the skepticism of a veteran looking at a plan from a too young officer. Book traced lines on the map with a pencil stub. James exchanged glances with Corporal Sam Robinson, who would later write detailed accounts of the engagement for military historians. Robinson, a former engineering student from Pennsylvania, had a talent for understanding terrain and fields of fire. He studied Book's proposed defensive arrangement with growing interest. The plan was unconventional, perhaps even reckless by standard doctrine. Instead of establishing a traditional defensive perimeter, with the machine guns positioned for mutual support in a predictable pattern, Book wanted to create what he called overlapping kill zones with carefully timed firing sequences. The 50 caliber would remain silent during initial contact, hidden on the reverse slope. The 30 caliber guns would be positioned not where doctrine suggested, but where they could create crossfire through specific gaps in the terrain. Most controversially, he wanted to hold fire until attacking forces were within 100 yards, far closer than the typical engagement distance of 300 to 400 yards. McKinley said, shaking his head. Book's response revealed both his youth and his particular genius. Then he continued. The meeting ended with grudging agreement to try Book's approach, though James later admitted he thought the lieutenant was going to get them all killed. The men spent the next day refining their positions, clearing precise firing lanes through the forest and pre-sighting their weapons on specific landmarks. Book personally walked each position, using a compass and handwritten calculations to ensure the angles would create the interlocking fire he envisioned. They finished their preparations on the evening of December 15th, just hours before the ground beneath them would begin to shake. At exactly 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, the earth erupted. German artillery, massed in concentrations not seen since the opening days of the conflict, began a barrage that lit the winter sky orange and sent concussive waves through the frozen ground. Book's men huddled in their foxholes as shells screamed overhead, most targeting positions further west, but enough landing near their ridge to shower them with frozen dirt and splintered trees. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it finally ceased, an eerie silence settled over the forest. broken only by the ringing in the men's ears and the creak of damaged trees settling. Then came a new sound, distant at first, but growing steadily louder, the rumble of engines and the clank of metal tracks. James, peering through the fog with binoculars from his concealed position, was the first to see them. Emerging from the mist like apparitions came column after column of troops, marching in formation along the road below. Behind them, the unmistakable silhouettes of armored vehicles, their exact count impossible to determine through the fog, but clearly numbering in the dozens. Book, in the forward observation post with Robinson, counted at least 600 infantry in the first wave alone. Behind them came the armor, Panzer IV medium armored vehicles and, more ominously, the heavier Panther variants, recognizable by their sloped frontal armor and long-barreled main weapons. Robinson later estimated they observed at least 15 armored vehicles in the first hour, though the fog and forest made accurate counting difficult. The young lieutenant's hands trembled as he cranked the field telephone, connecting him to battalion headquarters 3 miles west. He needed artillery support, reinforcements, anything. The voice on the other end belonged to Major Robert Criz, the battalion executive officer. Book insisted, his voice rising despite his training to remain calm. Criz's response was delivered in the weary tone of an officer dealing with what he assumed was combat inexperience. The line went dead. Book cranked the phone again. Nothing. A shell had cut the wire somewhere between his position and headquarters. They were alone, 18 men against what he now understood was the spearhead of a major offensive. Robinson said quietly, watching the enemy columns continue to file past below. Book's jaw tightened, then he paused. The decision violated every tactical doctrine about reconnaissance units avoiding engagement, but Book recognized what many senior officers would take hours or days to understand. His tiny platoon occupied the most critical terrain in this sector. The crossroads below their position was the only route suitable for armor to advance quickly westward. If the enemy secured it unopposed, they could pour forces through the gap before American commanders even realized an offensive was underway. He made his choice. The men received the order with grim determination. They had prepared for this, even if they had not believed it would actually happen. James settled in behind his .50 caliber, the weapon still concealed beneath camouflage netting. The two .30 caliber teams, led by Privates Robert Preston and Jordan Popp, made final adjustments to their positions. The riflemen, including Private First Class Aubrey McGehee, a former clerk who had volunteered for combat duty, checked their ammunition supply. Each man carried approximately 200 rounds. They would need everyone. The first test came at 0900 hours. A German patrol, 12 men moving cautiously up the hill toward American positions, approached to within 75 yards. Book watched them through his binoculars, hand raised to signal his men. The patrol leader, a sergeant based on his insignia, scanned the tree line with obvious suspicion. Something about the terrain looked wrong to him, too perfect for an undefended position. He was right to be suspicious. Book's hand dropped. The .30 caliber guns opened up simultaneously, their firing positions creating exactly the crossfire the lieutenant had envisioned. The German patrol had no cover, no concealment, and no chance. In less than 10 seconds, the patrol was completely neutralized. The Americans ceased fire immediately, preserving ammunition. Robinson said, amazement evident in his voice despite the circumstances. But Book was focused on what came next. The patrol's failure would draw attention. He was right. Within 30 minutes, a company-strength probe began advancing up the hill, approximately 120 soldiers, moving in dispersed formation using proper tactical bounds. These were not green troops, Book realized. The precision of their movement and their use of terrain indicated veteran soldiers. He waited until they reached the markers he had placed the day before, small stones barely visible in the snow. 90 yards. The lead elements were searching for the American positions, unable to see the carefully camouflaged foxholes. The second volley was more sustained. The .30 caliber guns fired in the overlapping sequence Book had planned, creating an interlocking pattern that left no safe ground in the kill zone. Riflemen added their fire, targeting individuals who sought cover. The attackers, unable to identify the exact source of fire due to the positions Book had chosen, returned fire wildly into the trees, missing the actual American positions by significant margins. After 8 minutes of sustained combat, the attack faltered and withdrew, leaving their casualties behind. Book's platoon had suffered no losses. Ammunition expenditure, approximately 1,200 rounds, 10% of their total supply, McKinley said, genuine respect in his voice for the first time. James added, the compliments were premature. Through his binoculars, Book watched German officers conferring at the base of the hill. Radio antennas indicated they were calling for support, heavy support. At 11:15 hours, the armored vehicles arrived, 4 of them, Panther variants, their main weapons more than capable of obliterating the log-covered foxholes, even without direct hits. The concussion alone from near misses could incapacitate the defenders. This was the moment Book's plan faced its greatest test. The armor advanced with infantry support, approximately 200 soldiers moving behind the armored vehicle's protective bulk. Standard American doctrine called for immediate bazooka fire against armor, attempting to disable vehicles before they could identify defensive positions. Book ordered his bazooka teams to hold fire. Robinson protested. Book replied, eyes locked on the advancing armor. The vehicles rumbled up the slope, their tracks chewing through snow and frozen earth. Behind them, German infantry maintained careful spacing, using the armor as mobile cover. They reached 75 yards, 60, 50. The psychological pressure on Book's men was immense. Every instinct screamed to fire, to do something before the armor crushed their positions. At 40 yards, the terrain changed exactly as Book had calculated. The slope increased sharply, forcing the armored vehicles to angle upward, exposing their thinner belly armor. Simultaneously, the accompanying infantry, focused on maintaining formation behind the vehicles, bunched together as the terrain narrowed. Book's voice cut through the tension. James's .50 caliber, silent until that moment, opened up from its concealed position on the reverse slope. The armor-piercing rounds, angled downward at the exposed bellies of the vehicles, had devastating effect. The lead vehicle shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The second vehicle, attempting to maneuver around the disabled leader, exposed its side armor to Private First Class Robert Lambert's bazooka. His rocket struck the junction between hull and turret. Not a killing blow, but enough to force the crew to abandon the vehicle. The .30 caliber guns, pre-aimed at the exact point where infantry would bunch when the armor stalled, created carnage among the supporting troops. The 2 rear vehicles, suddenly facing coordinated fire from positions they could not pinpoint, began backing down the slope, unwilling to advance without infantry support. The third attack had failed. 2 armored vehicles sat abandoned on the slope. German casualties mounted into the dozens. American casualties, still 0, though ammunition supplies were now below 50%. The radio crackled to life unexpectedly. Someone at battalion, finally taking Book's earlier report seriously, had repaired the telephone line. Major Crizz's voice, no longer dismissive, demanded a status report. Book reported, his voice hoarse from shouting commands. There was a long pause on the line. Criz replied. The relief never came. The telephone line went dead again minutes later, cut by artillery fire. Book and his men were still alone. The 4th attack began at 1300 hours and marked a change in German tactics. Artillery support preceded the assault, a rolling barrage designed to suppress the American positions. Shells walked up the hillside in a systematic pattern, a demonstration of the attackers' growing respect for the defenders. The Americans huddled in their foxholes as shrapnel whined overhead and concussion waves hammered their log-covered positions. When the barrage lifted, a full battalion-strength assault emerged from the forest. Approximately 500 infantry, supported by 7 armored vehicles. This was no longer a probe or a hasty attack. This was a deliberate, coordinated assault by professional soldiers determined to clear the position regardless of cost. McKinley said, voicing what every man was thinking. Book studied the assault through his binoculars, noting the spacing, the use of suppressive fire, the disciplined advance. Then he saw what he was looking for, a gap in the formation, a consequence of the terrain channeling the attack into predictable avenues of approach. It was exactly where his calculations had suggested it would be, he said. What followed was the longest sustained engagement of the day. For 43 minutes, Bouck's 18 men held against 500. The overlapping fields of fire channeled attackers into kill zones. The pre-sighted weapons meant every burst hit precisely where intended. The unconventional positioning meant German return fire consistently missed American positions by 5 to 10 yards, close enough to be terrifying but not close enough to be effective. But numbers began to tell. German soldiers, accepting horrific casualties, advanced yard by yard. The closest reached 35 yards from American positions before being forced back. Ammunition stocks fell to critical levels. James's .50 caliber, the backbone of the defense, went through its last belt. Preston's .30 caliber jammed from overheating, forcing him to clear the action under fire. At 13:43 hours, the assault reached its crisis point. German troops occupied positions within grenade range. Bouck's casualties mounted for the first time. Private McGeehee took shrapnel in the shoulder. Private Louis Khalil was struck by rifle fire in the leg. The position was about to be overrun. Then, inexplicably, the attack stopped. Robinson, peering over the edge of his foxhole, saw German officers pulling their men back, reorganizing for what appeared to be yet another assault. The pause made no tactical sense, unless something else was happening. The something else became apparent minutes later, when the first rounds of American artillery began impacting the valley below. Someone at higher headquarters, finally understanding the situation, had directed fire support onto the German assembly areas. The barrage was not massive, just 4 guns firing for effect, but it was enough to disrupt the attackers' preparation and buy Bouck's platoon precious minutes. The young lieutenant used those minutes to redistribute ammunition, treat wounded, and adjust positions. They had perhaps 200 rifle rounds remaining, 1 belt for the .50 caliber, maybe 400 rounds total for the .30 calibers. Against the next assault, those supplies would last perhaps 10 minutes. At 14:15 hours, as the artillery fire slackened, the final assault began. This time, 11 armored vehicles led the advance, with infantry in truly overwhelming numbers behind them. Bouck counted at least 800 soldiers, more than he had thought remained in the immediate area. The German command had clearly decided that this position, this ridiculously small American outpost, had to be eliminated at any cost. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Bouck's platoon could not stop this assault. The ammunition did not exist, the numbers were impossible. He gathered his men for what everyone understood might be their last moments, Bouck said, looking at each face. These were his men, most of them younger than he was, all of them exhausted, some wounded, all low on ammunition. They had accomplished something extraordinary, had held far beyond any reasonable expectation. But it was over. Then Robinson said something that changed everything. Bouck stared at him, then a slow smile crossed his face. The sergeant nodded. What happened next entered military legend as one of the most audacious gambles of the conflict. Instead of fighting to the last round, Bouck repositioned his men into what appeared to be a retreat, deliberately exposing their movement to make it visible to observers. The armored vehicles, seeing what looked like Americans abandoning their positions, accelerated their advance, eager to exploit the breakthrough. They drove directly into the trap Bouck had prepared but never used, a natural defile where the terrain forced vehicles into single file, with steep slopes on both sides preventing maneuvering. It was the one piece of terrain Bouck had studied most carefully and hoped never to use, because employing it meant his platoon would be in danger of being cut off from retreat. But they were not retreating. As the lead armored vehicles entered the defile, moving in column with infantry following closely, Bouck's men opened fire from positions on both flanks. The vehicles could not turn around in the narrow space. They could not advance past the obstacles Bouck's men had quietly placed days earlier, trees felled across the route and disguised with snow. They could not elevate their weapons enough to hit the American positions on the high ground. They were trapped. For 12 minutes, Bouck's platoon poured fire into the defile, not aimed at the armored vehicles, which were essentially invulnerable from the angles available, but at the infantry packed into the confined space behind them. The Germans attempted to deploy, to return fire, to escape the kill zone, but the terrain prevented effective movement in any direction. The butcher's bill was terrible. When the survivors finally retreated, 11 armored vehicles sat abandoned in the defile, unable to advance or withdraw. German casualties in that narrow space numbered in the hundreds. Buch's platoon had fired its last rounds. James's .50 caliber was silent, barrel glowing red. The .30 calibers had nothing left. The riflemen were down to bayonets and entrenching tools, but they had held. As darkness fell on December 16th, 1944, the sounds of combat finally faded from the ridge near Lanzerath. Buch's platoon, now out of ammunition and nearly surrounded, prepared to attempt a withdrawal under cover of darkness. They had held their position for 16 hours against forces more than 40 times their size, had neutralized at least 11 armored vehicles, and inflicted casualties estimated at over 500 soldiers. More critically, they had delayed the advance of the 1st Elite German Division by an entire day, time that allowed American forces to the west to prepare defensive positions and recognize the scale of the offensive they faced. Military historians would later calculate that Buch's platoon, through their delaying action, prevented the German offensive from achieving its initial objectives and contributed significantly to the ultimate failure of what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Evacuation came just after midnight. A relief company from the 2nd Division finally reached their position, arriving in strength with armor support. The officer who led the relief, Captain John MacDonald, later recorded his astonishment at finding only 18 men, 4 of them wounded, occupying positions he had expected to find held by at least a company of over 100 soldiers. MacDonald asked Buch. The young lieutenant, so exhausted he could barely stand, managed a weary smile. Then he gestured to the abandoned armored vehicles littering the approaches. In the weeks that followed, as the Battle of the Bulge raged and ultimately turned in favor of Allied forces, the story of Buch's platoon spread through the First Army. The laughed-at defensive plan, the crazy idea of a too young lieutenant that his own sergeants had doubted, had proven devastatingly effective against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Lyle Buch Jr. received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, though many who studied the action believed he deserved the Medal of Honor. Every member of his platoon received either the Silver Star or Bronze Star with V device for valor. When Buch's men were finally rotated to rear areas for rest in January 1945, they were among the most decorated small units in the entire European theater. But perhaps more meaningful than the decorations were the letters Buch received in subsequent years from the men he had led. William James, the farm boy from Iowa who had doubted the plan, wrote in 1947 about how he had returned to farming, applying the same attention to terrain and planning that Buch had taught him. Richard McKinley, the sergeant who had thought the lieutenant too young and too inexperienced, wrote that he had never served under a better officer before or after. Sam Robinson, the engineering student, went on to become a military historian who spent decades documenting small unit actions, always returning to that ridge near Lanzerath as the perfect example of leadership, planning, and courage. The German forces that assaulted Buch's position were part of the elite 6th Mountain Division, considered among the most effective units in the German armed forces of that era. Their commander, when interrogated after his capture months later, expressed disbelief when told the force that had held his division for an entire day consisted of just 18 men. He had estimated he faced at least 2 companies, possibly a battalion, based on the sophistication of the defensive plan and the effectiveness of the fire. When told it was a single reconnaissance platoon led by a 20-year-old lieutenant, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before saying, in German, something his interrogators translated as the finest compliment one professional soldier could offer another. The ridge near Lanzerath remains largely unchanged today. Visitors who know what to look for can still find the remnants of Buch's foxholes, the firing positions carefully sited to create those overlapping fields of fire. The defile, where 11 armored vehicles met their end, is still there. A narrow passage between slopes that looks entirely ordinary, until one understands how terrain can become a weapon in the hands of someone who truly understands its use. Lyle Buch Jr. survived the conflict and lived until 2007, passing away at age 86. In his later years, he rarely spoke about the 16 hours that made him famous, preferring to deflect attention to the men he had led. But in a final interview given to military historians, he reflected on why his unconventional plan had succeeded when conventional wisdom suggested it should have failed. Book explained, then he added, "It was a lesson learned at terrible cost in a frozen forest in Belgium, taught by a 20-year-old who understood that sometimes the craziest plan is the only plan that works." His squad had laughed at his ideas, doubted his judgment, questioned his experience. Then they followed him into 16 hours that proved genius often looks like madness right up until the moment it saves everyone's lives. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.